Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of this top 10, wrestlers that would have been better served at a different time frame, a different period. I got this idea from one of you guys out there, MGene8093, which I hope that stands for Mean Gene. We had talked about this about a month ago, and I decided to catch up and finally do this. With that being said, let's jump right in. I am going to say what time frame I do think they would work in better than when they originally were around. So with that, we're starting at number 10, Wendy RoR, and I'd love to see her right now in AEW. And you probably already understand why I'm saying this. At the time of me recording this, we've had a couple incidences where Tony Storm has name-checked Wendy RoR on AEW television. And as funny and as fun as that is, it got me to thinking, that's a match I'd actually like to see. Wendy RoR kind of was hampered by the time frame she was in with a lot of these people. She was a much better wrestler than most of the women she wrestled against. And I think her having that chance to shine now would be awesome. And I'd love to see her do it. It'd be really fun. It'd give us one really fun match at the very least. And I think it would be awesome to see her get that opportunity. Matter number 9. We're going to stay on the women's side of the wrestling world. Medusa, aka Alundra Blaze. And I'd like to see her in 2015 WWE all the way through now. And the reason I say 2015, because if you remember back, 2015 is when the quote-unquote women's revolution really took off, and they really started giving more prominent roles to the women, whether it be the Bellas, whether it be the Four Horsewomen, to the point now where a Becky Lynch, a Rhea Ripley, a Bianca Belair main events a pay-per-view, and you don't even bat an eye because they've grown that division so well that it just fits in. Much like I said with Wendy RoR, Medusa was well before her time, easily the best American women's wrestler of her generation. And I would have loved to see her get a chance to mix it up with some of the great women of this generation. Or even go back to, let's say, the Knockouts division in TNA when it had Awesome Kong and Gail Kim and Mickie James and the Beautiful People. It would have been great to see her mix it up with all them people. That's why she's on my list. I'll go from that on number 8. We just spoke about TNA. A TNA knockout, Lacey Von Erich. Lacey Von Erich probably would have been much better in the mid-80s in either Jim Crockett Promotions or World Class Championship Wrestling. Obviously, being a Von Erich, being in World Class would be optimal for her. I would have loved to see her be the valet of someone that was going up against them, whether it be Chris Adams or Gino Hernandez, or maybe even getting in with Skandar Akbar and helping with the monsters he had, like Abdullah or the One Man Gang. That would have been fantastic. She would have fit in very perfectly in Jim Crockett with your Sunshines, your Baby Dolls, your Preciouses, your Dark Journeys, all of the great valets of that era, which a lot of them worked in World Class as well. I think she would have been more suited to be a valet because, let's be honest, she was beautiful, she was athletic, but she wasn't a great wrestler. And like I said, it would have been really fun to see her manage against her family. Now, going from that, our number 7. We're finally getting over to the men's side of the wrestling world, and that's Karrion Kross, going back to the 90s, the mid-90s, ECW. Karrion Kross is such a great character and has such a presence to him that I kind of feel like his gimmick is wasted on this time. He would have been so much better taking over, let's say, when Raven left for WCW, and coming in as the big bad guy of ECW at that time frame. We've seen all through the history of ECW, whether it be Raven and his flock, or the Sinister Minister and Tajiri and Mikey Whipwreck. ECW wasn't afraid to take it to that place, to take it to that kind of dark, kind of demonic place. And I think Karrion Kross would have fit in perfectly there. And not saying that he's not good now, because I think he's really good. I just don't think that anybody has used him really well. Definitely not in the WWE as of yet. I think he'd be perfect for ECW. I'd love to see him in there. I'll go from that, our number 6. We're going to go with a tag team here, and that's High Voltage, the WCW team that was mostly seen on WCW Saturday Night, going back to the WWF in the late 80s. High Voltage was one of those situations, and I just talked about this the other day with Ice Train, who sadly passed away. Rest in peace, Ice Train. You could see they had something, but their gimmick and their look was probably 5 years too late, or 10 years too late. I could easily see High Voltage being a team that wrestles Power and Glory, or the Bushwhackers, or Demolition, or Powers of Pain, and they would fit in perfectly. They're almost an equivalent to the Steiner brothers in a lot of ways, where they were very talented, very athletically gifted. I don't think they ever quite got the push that the Steiners did. Obviously, they didn't, because the Steiners are one of the great tag teams of all time. But I think they would have, under Vince McMahon, under the mid-'80s, they would have been a perfect team for it. We're going from that on number 5. Someone that did work for Vince McMahon in the mid-'80s, the Soul Man Rocky Johnson, a.k.a. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's father. I think Rocky Johnson was ahead of his time, and he would have worked perfectly in the 2010s era of the WWE. The John Cena, Batista, Dolph Ziggler, Randy Orton, The Miz, MVP, mixing it up with that crew of people, your people like Sheamus. I think his charisma and his ring ability would have been better suited for a time where charisma and ring ability were more important than they were at the time he wrestled. And you have to take into account something that I heard Tony Atlas say about their time in wrestling, that when he would go into a promotion, basically any other black wrestler that was there, or African American wrestler that was there, would kind of be phased out because a promotion would only have one African American wrestler at the time, which WWE wasn't that case. There were a few. But I definitely understand what he's talking about, and I definitely see where he's coming from. So I think Rocky Johnson, in an era where him being who he is and as gifted as he was, and that not being held against him, I think he would have shined. He would have not been in the shadow of somebody like Tony Atlas. And that's not to say that Tony Atlas was better. Tony Atlas just was more of what Vince McMahon was looking for, and probably other promoters too at the time. But I'd love to see Rocky Johnson have had a great shot, and he would have worked out best, in my opinion, in that 2010s era of WWE. I'll go from that on number 4. Someone that was around in that era of WWE, the Master Lock, Chris Masters. Look, we all know it. Chris Masters would have been perfect in the late 80s WWF / early 90s WWF. Kind of similar to Sid Vicious or Dan Spivey at the time, or the Warlord and the Barbarian. They may have gave him a gimmick. Very much like Hercules. He was very much of the era of the bodybuilder, especially with the Master Lock. That Master Lock full Nelson would have been a great move to have in the 80s. I mean, Hercules used it. Billy Jack Haynes used it, and a dozen other wrestlers. But I think his size, his skill set, he would have been perfect for the more cartoony golden era of WWE, and I think he'd be a perfect fit there. We'll go from that on number 3. A guy that a lot of people say is the most underrated, or one of the most underrated wrestlers of all time, and that's Brad Armstrong, and I think he would be better served to be wrestling now. First off, look at the guy. He looks like he could be Kenny Omega's brother. The knock that I've always heard about Brad Armstrong was he wasn't as great as a promo as his in-ring talent. Now, if you take that and you go to this generation, and you look at somebody, and I'm not knocking the man, I love Kenny Omega. He's one of my favorite wrestlers. But you look at Kenny Omega, he's not a great talker per se. Where he shines is in the ring. And I feel like in this generation, you can more get by with being a great wrestler that isn't that great of a talker than you could have back in his time in the early to mid 90s. I'd love to see Brad Armstrong get in there and mix it up with guys like Omega, guys like Moxley, Seth Rollins. He would have great matches all over the board. One of the most underrated wrestlers of all time. I would have loved to see him get a chance where he would have actually had a chance to be something special. We'll go from that on number 2. From the late era of WCW towards the end, Blitz Cre. You may or may not remember Blitz Cre, but to me, he was one of the highlights of the dying days of WCW. He was everything that Rey Mysterio was, and kind of felt like he would be the next Rey Mysterio. Why I mention this is because I think he came along in WCW just about 3 years too late. If he would have been there in 96, 97, 98, building that cruiserweight division, we probably would have looked at him more fond. And conversely, if we would have took the Blitz Cre that we had in 2000, 99, whenever it was right around that time, 99, 2000 era, and we had him now going in the ring against guys like Vikingo, Commander, Dragon Lee, he would be a big star now. I think he was just barely off on his timing, where he was already at a point where people were checking out of WCW, and a lot of their cruiserweight talent had already left, so he didn't quite get to leave that mark. And unfortunately, he didn't stick around in wrestling too long. I think he had a couple injuries that pretty much made him hang up his boots. I would have loved to see him go full out. His matches with someone like the shirt I'm wearing, Ricochet, or Will Ospreay, would probably be legendary. A match with him and Hiromu Takahashi would be great. Desperado. I mean, he would be a fantastic addition to the New Japan Juniors roster right now, with all the talent he had. Now, before I get to my number one, if you haven't seen my videos before, I do a thing here called the Best of Rest. Basically, it was people that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, another tag team, Paul London and Brian Kendrick, and I'd love to have seen them in AEW or TNA right now. Now, we do get to see some of the fruits of their labor. Teams like the Young Bucks, teams like Private Party, the Lucha Brothers, Top Flight, the Rascals, they've all got roots in things that London and Kendrick did. London and Kendrick were so exciting and so revolutionary. Unfortunately, they were in a company that didn't care for the style of wrestling that they did and didn't want to promote it as well as they could have. That's why I think they'd be better served to be right now in either TNA or AEW. Last but not least on the Best of the Rest, above average Mike Sanders. And I think he would have worked best in the 2010s era of WWE. And the reason I say that, and this is not a knock on Mike Sanders, I think Mike Sanders could have been what The Miz became. A solid mid-card Intercontinental guy, couple world championship runs, a solid overall career. I think the problem was, much like I said with Blitz Cre, he came in towards the dying days of WCW. When he went to WWE, they didn't ever seem to give a crap about him, so he kind of floundered. I think if you took him and just pulled him 10 years later, his gimmick would have worked much better. The fact that he was a little bit of a smaller guy, but the cockiness, it's almost like he'd be somewhere between The Miz and MJF. I think he'd be a better version of The Miz, but maybe not quite as good as MJF. That's why I would have liked to see him at that time. Now, before I get to my number one, if you think I put someone too high, left someone too low, left somebody off the list altogether, let me know down here in the comments. While you're there, smash the like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. And finally, our number one wrestler, there was the right person at the wrong time. If I were to say to you, a bald man with a beard that had black boots, black trunks, and kicked ass no matter if it was face or heel, talked trash the entire time, who do you think of in your head? Obviously Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's not who I'm talking about here. I'm talking about Bad News Brown, aka Bad News Allen, a guy that predated Austin by a decade, actually more, and had a very similar gimmick to what Austin was. And basically, that's what I would do with Bad News Brown. If I could take Bad News Brown and move him anywhere in time, I would bring him into the Monday Night Wars on the WCW side. As much as WCW tried to make their own Austin with Bill Goldberg, they could have had their own Steve Austin with Bad News Brown, who in a lot of ways was the template for Steve Austin. He was a badass guy that just came in, kicked ass, no nonsense, took no names, took no prisoners, didn't care if you were heel, didn't care if you were face, he'd wrestle anybody. He would have been the perfect tweener to be in between the WCW and NWO as they were fighting. He could fight against people like DDP, and then the next month fight against people like Scott Hall, and no one would bat his eye because he would be the loner. I think he'd be absolutely perfect in the role. I think he was a great wrestler. He's a guy that when I was a kid, I always enjoyed watching. So that's why I think he'd be better in WCW during the Monday Night War era so they could have their own version of Stone Cold Steve Austin. With that being said, if you made it here to the end, let me know in the comments a wrestler you think that was in the wrong time and where you think they would work better. Let me know down here. Again, my name is George Coles, and this has been a Heel Heat Top 10.